Did you guys see that Mitch McConnell said that in the Republican Party that there's a cult of personality around Viktor Orban? I've been talking about this for a while, that Viktor Orban is going to CPAC, he's going to conservative conferences, and that his and his party, the Fidesz party, has been building ties with the Republican Party for years, and now the Trump movement has completely embraced it. When Trump is told that he's laughed on the world stage, people talk about him getting laughed at the UN. Who does he cite as an evidence that he's respected, that people fear him? The love of Viktor Orban. That Viktor Orban is out there basically campaigning for the man, saying that if you want peace in Europe, if you want peace, vote for Trump. He's going to conservative conferences advocating for Trump, building these ties. And the right-wing media space, like, for example, the documentary that Tucker Carlson made for Fox Nation on Viktor Orban, praises the man completely uncritically, if I'm being blunt with you guys. I mean, think about the Trump pitch. The Trump pitch is the deep state is corrupt. We don't like the deep state. We're sick of the corruption. We're sick of them advocating against the interests of the people. We're sick of the suppression of free speech and American freedoms and what makes America America. And we're here to make America great again. That's the basic pitch, okay? There's a few other things in there, but that's the pitch. Viktor Orban is leading the country that has the most public sector corruption in the entirety of the European Union. He's so corrupt and anti-democratic that he has about $20 billion of funds from the EU that has been frozen because of his inability to abide by EU regulations and guidelines. He has captured the media space, putting it under the control of either himself or subsidiaries and others that are controlled or allied with him, giving the opposition very little media time, even around election season, making it very difficult for the media to be able to for the opposition to be able to mount, well, opposition. That's not even, look, the corruption, God, what's the other one I'm thinking of? Oh, here's another one, family values. Well, you know, he might be a little corrupt. Well, you know, he might not play by the rules, but this is a guy who advocates for the family values over there in Hungary. What? You mean his party officials covering up sex scandals? His party, which is supposed to be seen as the party of family values, supposed to be the party of children, the candidates of children, the children's defenders that they've painted themselves as, and then when their friends and allies go diddle kids, they go cover it up for them. And this was a massive scandal in Hungary. There was massive protests over it. People resigned. You see Viktor Orban's polling data take a real dip after it. This is the party of family values. This is the party of anti-corruption. This is the guy you're going to choose to represent your values in Europe when you're fighting the swamp. He is the Hungarian swamp. If there is a swamp in Hungary, Viktor Orban is the swamp creature. So it doesn't make, not only do I not like the cult of personality around Viktor Orban because of his anti-Ukraine sentiments that I, of course, disagree with. I don't like it because of how he interacts with civil society. I do not like it because of how he just, well, constantly lies. I do not like it because his family values pitch is nonsensical. I don't like it because he's fiscally incompetent and he's running a gigantic deficit that is unsustainable in Hungary, which is part of the reason why he keeps leveraging Ukraine aid to get more money into his country. And he's horribly corrupt. He is the swamp. So for me, pitching Viktor Orban as, hey, look at this fresh new populist figure that's going to fight the... No. You've been conned. You've been taken in by this guy who sounds like Gru from Despicable Me, and you let him snatch your pockets. And sometimes it takes someone within your own party to recognize that. I'm not a McConnell fan, but even he can recognize a scam when he sees one. There we go.
About Hungary's decade-long drift into the orbit of the West's most determined adversaries. It's an alarming trend, and nobody, certainly not the American conservatives who increasingly form a cult of personality around Prime Minister Viktor Orban, can pretend not to see it. Hungary's leaders are cozying up to Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran in private. They're doing it publicly and vocally as well. Hungary's foreign minister has bemoaned that ongoing international sanctions make it, quote, really challenging to build effective economic and trade cooperation with the world's most active state sponsor of terror. I have little sympathy for Hungarian companies that struggle to profit from their ties to the genocidal regime in Tehran. Of course, that hasn't stopped Hungarian firms from committing tens of millions of dollars to financing joint nuclear projects with Iran. There's nothing tough about bowing to autocrats, and there's nothing for America's leaders to gain by praising those who do. Subservience to revanchist powers is not an American value, but far more importantly, it is not in America's interest.
I think part of the reason why we're able to see a lot more of McConnell bucking with the MAGA movement is he doesn't have to be Senate leader for much longer. He's going to be stepping down from that position. He's going to be going back in his turtle shell wherever he's from, going back being, cocaine Mitch to the locals. And somebody else is going to be taking over. Who that is going to be, I do not know. Hopefully it's not going to be too bad, but I was never a fan of Mitch McConnell. So you would think, oh, I'm excited. It's not going to be Mitch McConnell. But honestly, the party has deteriorated some point to the extent that it might actually end up being someone worse than Mitch McConnell, which is a hell of a statement to say out loud and something I wouldn't have said 4 years ago. Somehow it's gotten worse in the last 4 years than it wasn't gotten worse in the 4 years before that. Point is, though, he's walking out the door, and when you're walking out the door, you get to be more free with your tongue. It's like after Kevin McCarthy's whole speakership fight was over, when he was asked about Matt Gaetz, well, not even about Matt Gaetz, he was asked why everything went the way it went. He said, look, the reason it went the way it went is because when we were doing an ethics investigation into Matt Gaetz over the underage women he was having interactions with, that's what it was over, he didn't want that investigation to happen. He tried to shut it down. He made it integral for his support to shut it down. I wouldn't do it, and so I lost my job because he wanted to not be investigated. And by the way, I don't know if you guys know, but Matt Gaetz recently announced that he's no longer going to cooperate with the ethics probe into his behavior with these underage people. That might be an indicator that the ethics probe is not going the way he wanted. Orban's aide has said that if they were attacked by Russia, they wouldn't defend themselves. Fuck off. Did he really say that? Nah, no shot. That is such a level of cucking, of national cucking, that it's hard for me to believe that was a real thing that was said. It's hard for me to think that the same leader, Viktor Orban, who was, wasn't Orban was in a position of influence when Soviet tanks were leaving. And, it's something that, helped build his character at the time, or at least his image to the public. And that same guy wouldn't resist if the Russians invaded, according to his foreign minister, really? Although his aide. Orban aide faces backlash for saying Hungary wouldn't have fought a Russian invasion. My goodness. Hungary's most this happened today? Oh my God, how cucked. Hungary's most popular opposition figure called for the resignation of one of the prime minister's closest aides. By the way, this opposition figure, this opposition movement has been rising in the polls. I don't know how well it's going to turn out because it's just kind of like a broad-based opposition coalition, which makes it kind of difficult for you to define yourself. All you can define yourself really as is we are not Orban, we're for whatever he's not for. And if you go and you look at their policies, it's like increase the pension, do that. It's like a lot of stuff without specifics, ideologically vague. And if you can't define yourself, it's hard to be a real counterweight. But, Viktor Orban's been in power for 14 years now. If any problems are around in Hungary, it's kind of hard to blame it on anyone but his administration. And the deficit is bad. They're not able, his really expensive family values policies, like those basically social programs for those with children, have not really made a sustainable increase in the birth rate like many conservatives have claimed. There was a bump and then it plateaued because, hey, giving a bunch of people who were thinking of having kids money means that those people who were thinking about having kids and would have had kids if they got the money, they have kids. But that isn't an infinite supply, because if other people aren't having kids for other reasons that are not financially motivated, or it wasn't just a small financial barrier stopping them from having children, Like, that's going to have diminishing returns. The diminishing returns it did have was not a successful policy, or at least it was mildly successful, and then it crashed, and it certainly wasn't cost effective. And he's doubled down on the policies. That's what he's doing. He's trying to double down on the policies, seeing how much he can squeeze out of it. Oh my goodness, where were we? The aide, who isn't related to the prime minister, said on his podcast on Wednesday that the Ukrainian President Zelensky had made an irresponsible decision by opting to defend his country after Moscow launched its full-scale invasion. He said that Hungary had learned from its anti-Soviet uprising in 1956, which was eventually crushed by the Red Army, killing as many as 3,000 civilians and destroying much of the capital, that precious Hungarian lives must be treated with caution rather than offering them up for defense. Every country has a right to decide its own destiny for itself, he said, but based on 56, we wouldn't have done what President Zelensky did 2.5 years ago, because that was irresponsible. The leader of Hungary's strongest opposition, can I just quickly say, it was irresponsible only if number one, you don't value your country's freedom in any way, having a democracy, being able to vote for your leaders, not having everything just like imagine like having to live in a state where your corrupt leaders are placed by a foreign power and there's nothing you can do to remove them, because if you protest against them, like what happened in Belarus or Kazakhstan, the Russian army is just going to be sent in. So you have to first say that freedom isn't worth fighting for, right? Now, as an American, that's already something you've lost me on immediately. Because my conclusion then, especially because the comparison is terrible. When we talk about Ukraine, they had 200 to 250,000 standing troops at the start of the invasion. In Hungary, you had a bunch of protesters grabbing whatever they could and some people defecting. It's a totally different situation. You also had a gigantic military alliance that was willing to place bets on Ukraine. In 1956, due to the nature of the Cold War, there were no NATO troops that were entering. Now, there were, during the Prague Spring, and many times when they went to crush these protest movements, the soldiers would be told, oh my God, NATO's on the border, West German troops might invade. They were told stuff to try to encourage them to go do this, to create this environment of fear that there was an imminent Western invasion, to push these people forward as they had to go brutalize the public. They had to give them some reason to justify the awful things they were doing to their fellow human beings. But again, those were a bunch of civilians versus a professional standing army that stopped the Russians from taking Kiev. The comparison would be if the Russians took Kiev. The Russians were able, and the Soviets were able to take Budapest because there was no standing army. There was a standing army here. The situation is not comparable. To compare these situations, as a Hungarian, seems offensive to your own history. I mean, what are you suggesting? That if the Hungarians had an army that could have stopped the Soviet Union, they still should have given up their freedom? That the problem maybe was that the Hungarians were just, I don't know, they didn't fight hard enough, where the Ukrainians did, so they got to keep their capital while the Hungarians didn't? I think, honestly, this is offensive to Hungarians, to me. But that's the first thing. You don't value freedom, okay? You'd also have to again assume that this historical matchup actually works, which I do not think that it works. And the last thing, you have to assume that if you did submit to the Russians, that the Russians would treat you with grace. That what would happen is they would take Kiev and then nobody would die. That they would not grab for example, the poets or the authors or the civil society activists or the MPs and politicians, the judges, the media stars, the bloggers, and they wouldn't grab anybody in the Ukrainian armed forces who have a service during the war in the Donbass. They wouldn't grab them, put them in prison, or kill them like they did in Crimea. So you'd have to think that the Russians would break with their tradition of how they behaved, like Crimea. Plus, after Bucha, the idea of negotiating really took a big hit from the Ukrainian perspective, because from their mind, it's like, okay, if we submit, then are we just going to have mass graves across the whole country? So if you're like, oh, we need to preserve lives, do you think that the Russians wouldn't kill people if they just took over everything without resistance? Do you think if the Russians took Lviv, that there wouldn't be any violence in Lviv, that the people of Lviv, even if the government submitted, would take it lying down? Let's say Zelensky did surrender and fled the country. Do you think the rest of the country would take that? That just because you're willing to tuck your tail and run from a way that you frame as for the benefit of your country, that everybody else would? You think that the people who participated in the war in the Donbass would roll over? Again, I've said this before and I'll say it again. The reason the country didn't fall, while you could say that the government being stable and collected and not running away did definitely contribute to a stronger defense, the lion's share of it is the Ukrainian people. And when you look out east, you see the Ukrainian people like throwing trash in the road to try to stop the advance of the Russian army during the early days, trying to stop them from capturing the nuclear power plant. Protests that were put down with gunfire. You think there would be no protests? Because if there's protests, then there's going to be gunfire. Look, I think that this is not only, of course, insulting to the Ukrainians and disregards them, and this is something you can easily say once you're behind the defensive shield of the most powerful military alliance God has ever known, with over 1 billion souls in its collection. This would be like me this is me going, okay, I'm living in the United States saying like, oof, well, you know, if I was living in Syria, I would simply just stay there and fight for my country. You can say that 1 million times over. You're never going to face that situation in your life. And if you did, you might find that making a decision about something like that is a lot more difficult when you have no food in your stomach and your child's going to starve to death. So this is something you like, oh, we wouldn't defend our freedoms or our country or anything in this situation. Yeah, it's an easy thing to say once you don't have that real threat on your border. Like, oh, if I was to fight this war, we would not use cluster bombs or mines or anything like that we would consider slightly immoral. Then you start getting gassed by the Russians. You might change your tune on exactly what you're willing to do to defend yourself. Point is, this is easy to say when you're already in NATO. You're already in a defensive alliance. That means you're not going to get invaded. You're protected by a nuclear umbrella that includes the United States. And this scenario that you're drawing up has no chance of happening. Yes, under those conditions, then you can preach this holier than thou, never resist, never fight, just roll over, protect nothing. Nothing is important. Everything is morally gray. This bland bleh ideology that doesn't value the sacrifices that even Hungarians made in fighting for their own freedom. Again, this is not only insulting Ukrainians. I think this is mostly insulting to Hungarians. Let me hear, again, Viktor Orban, the brave hero of the conservative movement. What do your advisors say? Don't fight for freedom. Roll over. Nothing is worth dying for. Wow, how American. Let's have that guy speak at TPUSA. Okay, moving on.